الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وعملا يا رب العالمين. So we've been covering chapters from this book right here. It's called The Alchemy of Happiness. In Arabic it's known as Kimya us-Sa'ada. And it's originally written by Imam al-Ghazali in Persian. And then it was translated into Arabic. And now it's translated into English. And we've been covering chapter 1, where in chapter 1 we've been speaking about knowledge of the self. And we spoke a little bit about why it's so important to try to understand yourself, spiritually speaking. We spoke about the understanding of the self as explained by the scholars of the past. We spoke about the idea of the human being being primarily a soul with a body that transports the soul. And so we discussed it quite a bit, and we're just finishing off now chapter 1, insha'Allah ta'ala. Last week we spoke a lot about the self and disciplining the self and having animalistic tendencies, desires, appetites. We spoke about anger and aggression and how these are traits that if they dominate the human, then the human being ends up being more animalistic than human. Whereas if a human being is able to develop a spirituality within themselves, that they can become more like angels, angelic in nature. And we see people like that. The way they behave, the way they talk, the way they conduct themselves. There's something unique about them. They're not just your average human being. And so, we spoke about, the nafs and the self quite a bit. Now, one of the questions that obviously arises when you talk about that is, look, if I look at myself and I find that I have all these flaws, I find myself to be someone who is very much driven by their appetites. I find myself someone who is overcome by anger, overcome by aggression a lot. And so I'm very almost animalistic in nature. What do I do about it? How do I try to correct that? And so the scholars have advised us that essentially what an individual has to do is first identify. First identify what's happening within your life. And that requires self-awareness. That requires the ability to notice on a daily basis your own behaviors. Notice how you're behaving. Notice what drives your behavior. Why is it that you ate that piece of cake? Why is it that you reacted the way you reacted? What was driving it? One of the tricks of Shaitan is to couch our behavior in religious terms. You're doing it for a religious reason. But if a person digs deeper and is honest with themselves, they can find that they're doing it actually for their own ego. To satisfy their own ego. To, pacify their own anger. And so I'm speaking the truth, speaking haqq to this person, telling them what's right. Meanwhile, it's rooted in arrogance, a superiority complex. It's very possible. And we have to be wary of that. So Imam al-Ghazali, when he speaks about how do you refine your character, he says you have to do the opposite of what you're currently doing. And you have to force yourself to display the qualities you want to display. For example, imagine you find yourself to be someone who's very miserly. Someone who's miserly, who doesn't like to spend. So, what was really interesting is I saw an app today. It was really interesting. It was an app where basically you turn the app on, and everybody who's eating food with you, like who just went to a restaurant with you, they put their finger on the screen. And a light goes around. And every time it lands on someone's finger, that person lifts their finger and they don't have to pay. And the idea was that this way you can determine who pays for everybody, and there's no fights about it. What was interesting is as I was watching it, I was assuming it was because everyone wanted to pay. That's what I thought it was. I thought everyone there wanted to pay. So to solve that dilemma, put your finger on, let the app decide who is the last person standing with their finger on the screen, and that person gets to pay. But then when I rewatched the video, the first person who got the finger off, like, yes! I said, oh, y'all are trying to play this game to avoid paying. I said, shut up, man. Like, y'all have no shame? Like, what do you mean? Right? Like, wallahi, as I'm watching, I'm thinking, that's going to solve a lot of the problems we have, right? With our, mashallah, legendary fights over the bill. But apparently it's being used for something else, the total opposite. And if someone's miserly, they don't want to spend money, they don't want to spend on others, they get happy when they don't have to pay. They don't want to give in charity. That's a sign that they're miserly. So first is to identify yourself, that I find it really difficult to spend on other people. I find it really hard to give in charity. If you can just start with identifying that. He says then, you have to force yourself to be someone who's generous. Look for opportunities to be generous and spend. And obviously when you find the opportunity, your nafs is going to tell you, no, don't do it. Keep your wallet in your pocket. Act like you left it at home. And you have to fight yourself to say, no, this is literally what I need to do. Right? Oftentimes, we need work where it pains the most, or where it's weakest. Right? Like the person who's really strong in one part of their body will go and work that one out every single time because they feel good. They're good at it. Like they're able to perform well with that one body part in terms of arms, legs, whatever it is. But it's the other parts of the body that are weak. They need the most work. But yet we tend to neglect it because it's the least comfortable. And oftentimes what? You have to lower the weight big time. You know what I'm saying? Lower the weight big time compared to when you're working out a different part of the body. And so a person could show really good qualities in one aspect of their life. They're just really, really kind or really, really humble. But then when it comes to their generosity, they're struggling. Or they could be very generous and struggle with humility. And it's easy to just kind of focus on what you're really good at. But to identify the flaws and say, I'm going to actively work to correct that. Looking for opportunities to address this flaw I have within me. He gives the example also of, right, a person who's arrogant. Recognizes that, hey, I'm really arrogant. Okay, I need to address this. Let me look for occasions, opportunities, where I am forced to display humility. And often that's in the service of other people. In serving others, you are forced to put them before yourself. You're forced to do what they want, what makes them happy. It's not about you. And you're put in a position where, because you're serving, you're seen as lower, oftentimes. You're just the door person. You're just the person who fixed the shoes. And then so there's not much regard for the individual. And for someone who thinks of themselves as very high, that's one of the most painful things. But that's exactly what you need. Do you understand? Like, that's exactly what you need. And so he says, it's like, when a paper is bent this way, to straighten it, what you got to do? Bend it the other way, right? You bend it the other way so that it just, what? Not that it's crooked the other way, but that kind of balances out and you come out straight. And so he says, Imam al-Ghazali says, how do you know when you have good character? When all these good character traits flow from you with ease. You don't have to force yourself to be humble. You don't have to force yourself to be generous. You don't have to force yourself to be courageous. Because if you have to force yourself, it means immediately that it's not natural to you. It's not a trait of your soul. The ideal is that you've worked on yourself and trained yourself through practice and habit, that you get to a point where you don't have to force it. It just flows. Just naturally, you're humble. You're just naturally generous. You're naturally modest. You're naturally courageous. That's the goal. That's the sign of having developed, not that you do good things, but now that you have a soul that has goodness in it. Like it's almost innate. It's inherent to your soul, is it flows from you with ease. That's why the Prophet ﷺ, Imam al-Ghazali mentions, when it came to prayer, he said what? The prayer was the coolness of his eyes. Like it was not a burden. Isn't that interesting? Because a lot of us will find prayer at times to be burdensome. Like I have to get up for Fajr. Meanwhile, the Prophet ﷺ would tell Bilal radiallahu anhu, "O Bilal, give adhan. Arihna biha ya Bilal. Give our hearts peace and comfort, O Bilal. Give adhan so we can pray." Which is so interesting. Because it means, because his soul was purified, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And so, there was no resistance from within. Why might we have resistance to prayer, for example? Any ideas? Like, it's prayer time. Now you want to get up and pray because you know you're supposed to go pray. But then the nafs speaks up. Says what? You have more time. So it's like procrastination. Okay, what else would there be? That your nafs would want that would hold you back from fulfilling that command. What could it be? Any ideas? It tells you you're busy, right? You're probably busy with what? With work. Why is work so important? Because you love money. You start to see how you can trace it back. What else is it?
You're exhausted.
You're tired. There's laziness now. So now it means your own comfort, your own pleasure is more important because your nafs is so strong. Do you see that? The Prophet ﷺ found pleasure in prayer. And Imam al-Ghazali, he says, the heart's food, this is such a profound point he makes. He says, the heart's food is wisdom, knowledge, and the love of God. And he says, it only diverges from the demands of its nature when it's afflicted by some disease. When does a person no longer, example, desire food? I don't have any appetite. Maybe you're sick. Right? Maybe you're sick. A lot of times when people are sick, it's the hardest thing to do is to get them to eat. Right? A lot of people have experienced that. You're sick, you know you need to eat, but you don't have any desire to eat. That's a sign you're sick. Right? So he says, the natural appetite of the soul, of the heart, is knowledge, it's wisdom, it's the love of God. And he says, if your soul or heart is not inclined towards that, it must be afflicted by some disease. Just as the stomach may be afflicted by an illness which prevents it from the food and drink, and desiring the food and drink which give it actual life. And so he says, thus, every man's heart which inclines to anything but the love of God is afflicted by a disease in proportion to their inclination. And that's something to think about, right? And so what do you do about that? The scholars would typically always advise going to somebody who is well-versed in diseases of the heart. Well-versed does not mean that they have knowledge of it, but that they demonstrate it, that they live it. You see somebody who shows through their actions that they are a humble person, a generous person, a courageous person, a person whose nafs has very little power over them. And such people are very, very unique. And usually that they were able to attain that state because of being aware of it and working on it. So then they can advise you on how to work on it. Now in the absence of that, if you don't know someone like that, what you do? Then you keep good company to learn from them. Because, many of you can think of a friend you had that showed immense courage and inspired you to become courageous. Or they were very generous and you were like, wow. And then you started trying to be like them because you also wanted to be generous. Or someone was really humble, you're like, I want to be like that too. Someone had a passion for knowledge, you're like, okay, I also want to learn like this person learns. So being in good company is a means of learning from their good character. And then, what about if you don't have good company around you? You're surrounded by people who, unfortunately, don't have good character. Well, that's an opportunity to practice your good character. Where do you practice patience? With nice people? No. Because you don't have to be patient. They're nice. They're kind. You don't have to ever practice it with them. When do you develop patience then? It's when you encounter somebody who's not nice to you and you feel like lashing out at them. That is the moment of practicing your patience. So every negative encounter is actually an opportunity to refine your character. Really. Yeah. It's actually an opportunity to refine your character. Have you ever seen somebody who grew up surrounded by people, either in family or friends or wherever, surrounded by people who mistreated them? And subhanAllah, as ironic as it sounds, it made them a better person. Because they recognize how terrible this character is, and they're like, I don't want to be this. And they learn to be patient with it. They learn to develop forbearance. And they also learned, I don't want to be this. And so they made a conscious effort to not be that way. Which is so interesting. Because they may never have developed that patience and that tolerance and that forbearance if they were not surrounded by those difficult circumstances. So, there's a famous anecdote that's given about the coffee bean, I think it's the egg, and the carrot. Y'all have heard of that? No? It's one of those really nice stories. There's boiling water, a person puts in an egg. What does the egg end up doing? Is hardening. The boiling water causes it to harden. And then you have a carrot, which is hard, you put it in boiling water and it becomes mushy. And so the boiling water caused it to lose its hardness, but it no longer has any strength to it. A lot of people don't like that texture. Anyone here like that? I know family members who just cannot eat food of that texture. Like you give them a fresh carrot, they'll eat it. But if it's like a little mushy because it was on the barbecue or something, they're like, no, I can't do it. Okay, and then you have a coffee bean. A coffee bean's interesting. It has to be the coffee bean, everybody. But you put the coffee bean in, and it retains its strength. But it doesn't just retain its strength, it influences the water all around it. And it makes coffee. Do you understand? And so then that's pretty much an analogy for how do you respond to the difficult circumstances that come about in your life. Do you harden? Or now you build this hard shell around you, and you become bitter and resentful, and you're just really difficult to be around, always complaining? Or do you become extremely, extremely weak, such that you lose all motivation, such that you're not able to go and pursue what you wanted to pursue? Neither is good. Neither extreme is good. Or what if you become the coffee bean, where you don't let it break you, but instead, that it is through that boiling water that you're able to give. And it's easier said than done. Of course, I acknowledge that. But every opportunity that's difficult is really a chance to work on our character, if we only saw it that way. Okay, Imam al-Ghazali goes forward in this book of Qimya al-Sa'ad. What I just quoted is not from the Qimya al-Sa'ad. It's not from the book that we're reading. And that's why it's not on the slides. What I just quoted to you about the heart's disease and about how to work on your character is from a chapter in his Ihya Ulum al-Din, which is known as, the chapter title is Kitabu Tahdhib al-Akhlaq wa Kasr al-Shahwatayn, which has been translated as disciplining the soul and breaking the two desires. And you'll find this discussion in there. Anyways, we're going to continue, inshallah, with this book that we're reading. Imam al-Ghazali says, anyone who will look into the matter will see that happiness or felicity is necessarily linked with the knowledge of God. Anyone in whom the desire for this knowledge has disappeared is like one who has lost his appetite for healthy food, or prefers eating clay over eating bread. This is an interesting analogy. What he's saying is that each part of us finds its joy in what it was created for. And its health is also dependent on its use. So your appetite finds joy in fulfilling the desire of eating. Lust is not satisfied by looking at a beautiful sunset. Lust is satisfied, and you find joy through lust in fulfilling that lust. Anger finds joy. That part of you feels good after you express that aggression. Your body in general stays healthy through what? Through movement, because the body was not created to lie down or sit around. It was created to move. The mind, this is actually a really important one. I can't emphasize this one enough. It happens to a lot of people who are in university and they graduate. Because in university, usually your mind is very active. You're constantly being exposed to new ideas. So you have to make sense of it. And then you have to study it. And you have to revise it. But when people graduate, oftentimes they'll get a new job. They'll settle into the job. They'll learn how to perform their tasks at work. And that's it. They'll just repeat that. They'll go home and there'll be entertainment. And their mind, their brain is getting no stimulation. And they kind of just stagnate. And they wonder why. They're like, I don't know, life's not that interesting anymore. Meanwhile, in university, because you're forced through the courses to engage with new ideas and think about new things, you develop quite a bit of thought. And you think about new things, and it's really, really satisfying. You find yourself growing. You're seeing the world in a new light every month because of the new ideas you're exposed to. Anybody can relate to what I'm talking about here? Once you graduate, it's very easy to stagnate. People don't tend to open up any books anymore. And so then you wonder why I feel so lethargic, mentally lethargic. It's because we're not exposing ourselves to new ideas. We're not growing. We're not keeping the mind active. Not with anxiety and stress, but with new ideas. And then what about the soul? The soul, it's been created to know God. It finds its joy in knowing God. But if we don't fulfill that, then spiritually we're going to feel lethargic. We're going to feel unhealthy. The body needs to move. The mind needs to be at work. The soul also needs to be at work. The soul also needs to be engaged. What's interesting is that even human appetite for food, it can become distorted. How many of you all have experienced that? That when you're eating unhealthy, you only desire unhealthy food. The moment you're able to discipline yourself a little bit and start to eat healthy, and if you can keep it going long enough, unhealthy food will start to look unappealing. How many of you have seen that happen in your life? In a really interesting way, where you're like, you know what? Before, I would have loved to have that piece of cake, but ever since I've been on a diet for the past 2, 3, 4 months, I just don't find it appealing. And it's weird, because you're like, I never thought I would be at a point where I would say no to sugar. But subhanAllah, if you just wean the appetite. And so it's interesting that the appetite can desire what's not good for it. And it can believe that this is what I need. Until someone comes along and says, it can be so much better. Cut it out. No, but I can't live without sugar. Cut it out and try. And they do, and they're like, wow. I didn't know. I had no idea that this is what it would feel like. The same thing is about the soul. A lot of us cannot believe, I can't live without this sin. I can't live without that disobedience. My life would be terrible. But that's what's so interesting, is if the individual leaves that sin and really corrects their appetite, spiritual appetite, they'll find enjoyment in prayer. They'll find enjoyment in reciting the Quran. They'll find enjoyment in going to the masjid. Do you understand? It is hard to imagine. It's hard to understand that if you're not like that, if you've never tried it out. Ramadan is a beautiful time to kind of witness that. A lot of people, Ramadan is a time where they get a taste of this. They're like, wow. Towards the end, they're like, you know what? I enjoy standing in Taraweeh. I don't know why. I just enjoy it. At the beginning of the month, it's a little bit of a burden. And for many, by the end, they look forward to it. The qiyams that they pray late night, the Quran that they're reciting. Because you've built up a healthy spiritual diet. You can correct it, is my point. You can correct it. If you're finding that your spirit, your soul, is currently seems to be pursuing other things and you can't imagine, try it out. Give it a shot. You'd be surprised. That's why some of the pious, you know what they would say? They would say that if the kings, if they had any idea the peace and contentment that we find and the enjoyment that we find in our acts of worship, they would leave their kingdoms and their luxuries and their, extravagances that they enjoy, and they would come join us. They had no envy for those who had a lot of the dunya. It's like someone who's healthy and sees someone eating sugar, and they're like, I don't envy you at all. It's not appealing to me. If anything, I feel bad for you. I'm like, man, maybe you should come over here. It's very interesting, right? Okay. Imam al-Ghazali says, if man knows not his own soul, which is the nearest thing to him, what is the use of his claiming to know other people? It's as if a beggar who lacks sufficient food should claim to be able to feed a town. This is very interesting. In Arabic, there's a saying, فَاقِدُ الشَّيْء لَا يُعْطِيهِ. The one who lacks something cannot give it to other people. The one who lacks something, he cannot give it to other people. You don't have it. You don't know yourself. How would you know anybody else? And because we understand other people through an understanding of ourselves. Otherwise, here's the thing. How do you know you're not projecting? Do you understand? How do you know you're not projecting? How do you know that you're not being triggered by your own insecurity, and now to cover that up, you accuse the other person of doing it? How do you know you're not hating in someone else what you actually despise in yourself? What you're actually ashamed of in yourself? And so when you lack self-awareness, you will inevitably struggle to understand other people. And I'll give you an example. Imagine someone who's really arrogant. They constantly think of themselves as something special. And so if they think they're special, they're going to demand and expect special treatment. And what happens when people don't give them that special treatment? People just treat them like everybody else. They might deem it disrespectful. No? They might see it as disrespectful. This person's so disrespectful. Meanwhile, the person's just treating them like everybody else. But this person's got this bloated sense of self, so they're expecting far more than they deserve. And so they're miscalculating and misjudging someone else's treatment of them. They're misjudging it because they don't realize that the flaw is within them. Do you see that? Or someone who's very entitled. They'll feel like the whole world is unfair. Nobody's nice, nobody's fair. Because they feel entitled. Really? Like nobody in the world is fair? Nobody. So the whole world is wrong, but you, mashallah, somehow got it right. Yes. Well, that's a lack of self-awareness. The problem is you. But you have no self-awareness, so you think everybody else is the problem. When you don't know yourself, it's very easy to begin to think that everybody else is the problem. And a big sign of maturity, how many of you would admit this in your own lives? A big step towards maturity for you was when you realized, I'm to blame for a lot of my own problems. How many of you would say that? Show of hands. And it's hard. Because you'll see the 13-year-old who says, what? Everybody's out to get me. Right? Everybody's out to get me. Everybody wants my downfall. You're not that important. People are not plotting to take you down. But that's how, when you are entitled and you have your own, the world revolves around me mentality, then of course, you see everybody else as the problem. And that's one thing about people like Imam al-Ghazali. He's very humbling. He says, in truth, man in this world is extremely weak and contemptible. In this world, you're very weak and contemptible. He says, look, really, how strong are you? How special are you? He says, if you have a slight chemical imbalance in your mind, he didn't say exactly those words. I put some of that in there based on modern research, but essentially he's saying, if anything little goes wrong in your mind, now you have mental health struggles. Very easy. It can very easily lead to mental health struggle. A wasp stings you. Oh man, it's hard to sleep, right? You ever have to scratch your back, and you couldn't even focus until you scratched that part on your back? The human being can't even focus because of a little itch. When you become angry because of a slight misfortune, he says something really, really, subhanAllah, challenging. He says the human being thinks they're beautiful. The human being thinks that they're beautiful. He says, really? Just peel the layer of skin, and then what do we see? He uses the word nauseating flesh, nauseating blood underneath. Isn't it interesting how if we see somebody whose skin has been peeled, and I'm sorry to say this, but it's hard to look at. Meanwhile, every single one of us carries that underneath our own skin. He says, really, what do you think about yourself? This is very humbling. This is very humbling compared to the what? The culture of you're amazing, you're just great, you're perfect. This is the total opposite. This is you're weak and contemptible. And sometimes that's what we need. Sometimes that's what we need. He says, look, if you don't take a bath, as beautiful as you think you are today, if you don't take a bath, you don't wash, you're going to smell. You're going to be repulsive. That's what he says. It's humbling. It's a humble reminder of really you think you're special? Really? He says, it's only in the next life that you're going to be of value. If by means of the alchemy of happiness, which is the knowledge of God, that the human being can rise from the rank of beasts to that of the angels. Otherwise, he says, the human being's condition will be worse than the brutes. See, at least the animals, when they die, they're just buried. That's it. There's no Jahannam for animals. He says the human being is going to be worse than animal. Why? Because if you don't fulfill your purpose and know God, then you will die. But you will not just merely die and be, turned to dust and that's it. You will be entered into Jahannam. So he says, you're worse. You're worse. And so now he turns to the knowledge of God. We'll stop here, inshallah. There was a lot that I wanted to cover here, but I don't want to prolong and extend the session too long. So we'll stop here, inshallah. May Allah Ta'ala grant us tawfiq to recognize ourselves, who we are truly, so that we can recognize Allah. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين.